The black car pulled up slowly in front of the old building. It was one of those cars that cost more than most people make in 10 years. The kind of car that made everyone on the street stop and stare. Inside sat a man who had everything money could buy. His name was Richard, and at 52 years old, he owned one of the biggest technology companies in the country. Richard stepped out of the car and looked at the building in front of him. The sign above the door read, "Hope Children's Home." The paint was peeling off the walls. The garden was small, but someone had tried to keep it clean. It was nothing like the fancy places Richard visited every day. But today, he had a reason to be here. You see, Richard had made a big mistake a few months ago. He had said some terrible things about poor people in an interview. The video went everywhere on the internet. People were angry. They stopped buying his products. His business partners were worried. His public relations team told him he needed to fix his image fast. Adopt a child, they said. Visit an orphanage. Let the cameras see you being kind. People will forget about the video. Richard did not really want to adopt anyone. He lived alone in a house with 12 bedrooms. He had never been married. He had no children. And honestly, he liked it that way. Children were loud. Children were messy. Children asked too many questions, but his team was right. He needed to do something. So here he was, standing in front of an orphanage with 2 camera people and 3 assistants following his every step. The director of the orphanage came out to meet him. She was a kind-looking woman in her 60s with gray hair and warm eyes. Her name was Mrs. Chun, and she had been running this place for over 20 years. "Welcome, welcome," she said with a gentle smile. "The children are so excited to meet you." Richard forced a smile and shook her hand. His assistant whispered in his ear, "Remember to look happy." The cameras are rolling. They walked inside. The building was old but clean. The walls were painted in soft colors. There were drawings made by children hanging everywhere. Richard looked around and tried to seem interested. But inside, he was counting the minutes until he could leave. Mrs. Chun led him to a large room where about 30 children were waiting. They ranged from about 4 years old to 15. When they saw Richard walk in, most of them jumped up with excitement. They had been told a very important man was coming, someone who might give one of them a home. Richard smiled and waved. He shook hands with some of the older kids. He patted the heads of the younger ones. The cameras captured everything. His assistant kept nodding with approval. "These are wonderful children," Mrs. Chun said proudly. "Each one of them has their own special story, their own special gifts." Richard nodded, but he was not really listening. He was looking around the room, trying to find the perfect child. Someone cute. Someone who would look good in photographs. Someone who would not cause any trouble. And then he noticed something strange. While all the other children crowded around him, one boy sat alone in the far corner of the room. He was small and thin, maybe 7 or 8 years old. He had messy dark hair and big brown eyes that seemed too old for his young face. He wore clothes that were clearly too big for him. And in his arms, he held a worn-out notebook, like it was the most precious thing in the world. The boy was not trying to get Richard's attention. He was not smiling or waving. He just sat there quietly, watching everything with those deep, sad eyes. Richard found himself staring at the child. There was something about him, something different. "Who is that boy?" Richard asked Mrs. Chun. The director's smile faded a little. She looked at the corner where the boy sat alone. "That is little Daniel," she said softly. "He has been with us for 5 years now." 5 years? Richard raised an eyebrow. Why has no one adopted him? Mrs. Chun sighed. It was a heavy sigh, the kind that carried years of worry inside it. "Daniel is a special case," she explained. "His mother passed away when he was only 3. She was very sick for a long time. After she died, his father could not handle the grief. He left Daniel at a hospital one night and never came back. Richard felt something strange in his chest, but he pushed it away quickly. "That is sad," he said, "but there must be many children here with sad stories. Why has no one wanted him specifically?" Mrs. Chun looked at Daniel with gentle eyes. The boy was still sitting alone, not paying attention to anyone. "Daniel does not speak much," she said. "When he first came here, he did not speak at all for almost a year. Some people think he is slow, or that something is wrong with him. Families who come here want children who are cheerful and active. Daniel is quiet. He keeps to himself. He scares people, I think. Scares them? Not in a bad way," Mrs. Chun added quickly. "But when you look into his eyes, you see something deep, something most people do not understand. They find it easier to choose a child who smiles and laughs. Daniel rarely does either." Richard looked at the boy again. Daniel had opened his old notebook and was looking at something inside. His small fingers touched the pages gently, like he was holding something sacred. "What is in that notebook?" Richard asked. "We do not know exactly," Mrs. Chun admitted. "He never lets anyone see it. He carries it everywhere. Sleeps with it under his pillow. One of the staff members tried to take it once to wash it because it was getting so dirty. Daniel cried for hours. We never tried again." Something about this boy bothered Richard. Not in a bad way, but in a way he could not explain. Here was a child who did not run toward money and power. Here was a child who did not try to impress anyone. Here was a child who seemed to carry the weight of the whole world on his tiny shoulders. And for some reason, Richard could not look away. The other children were still talking and laughing around him. His assistants were taking notes. The cameras were still rolling. But Richard's eyes kept going back to that corner, to that small boy with the old notebook. He did not know it yet, but that moment would change his life forever. That quiet child sitting alone in the corner was about to teach this rich, powerful man a lesson he would never forget. Richard just did not know it yet. None of them did. Mrs. Chun continued the tour. She showed Richard the dining hall where the children ate their meals together. She showed him the small library filled with donated books. She showed him the playground outside where the kids played during sunny afternoons. Through it all, Richard nodded and smiled for the cameras. He said all the right things. "How wonderful. What a lovely place. These children are so lucky to have you." But his mind kept wandering back to that boy. To Daniel. At one point, Richard excused himself and walked back toward the recreation room. He stood in the doorway and watched. Most of the children had gone outside to play, but Daniel was still there, in his corner, looking at his notebook. And something happened that made Richard's heart skip a beat. Daniel got up slowly and walked toward an old piano that sat against the wall. It was a dusty thing, the kind of piano that looked like it had not been played in years. Some of the keys were yellow with age. The wood was scratched and worn. Daniel sat down on the bench. His feet did not reach the floor. He placed his notebook carefully beside him. Then he lifted his small hands and let them hover over the keys. But he did not play. He just sat there, his fingers trembling slightly above the keys, as if he was afraid to touch them, as if playing would hurt him somehow. Richard watched for a full minute. The boy never pressed a single key. Finally, Daniel dropped his hands, picked up his notebook, and walked back to his corner. What was that about? Richard wondered. Why did he not play? He did not ask anyone. He did not mention what he saw. But for the rest of the visit, he could not stop thinking about it. About that old piano. About those trembling hands. About the sad look in Daniel's eyes when he walked away from the instrument. When it was time to leave, Richard shook Mrs. Chun's hand once more. "Thank you for having us," he said. "This was very educational. Will you be coming back?" Mrs. Chun asked hopefully. "Perhaps to meet with some of the children one-on-one?" Richard looked across the room one last time. Daniel was still in his corner, holding his notebook, watching the rich man with those deep, knowing eyes. "Yes," Richard heard himself say. "I think I will." He did not know why he said it. He had no real intention of coming back. This was supposed to be a one-time thing for the cameras. Get in, look good, get out. But as his fancy car drove away from the orphanage, Richard could not shake the image of that little boy from his mind. There was a story there, a mystery. And for the first time in many years, Richard found himself curious about something that had nothing to do with money or business. Who was Daniel? What was in that notebook? And why did he look at that old piano like it held all the secrets of the universe? Richard stared out the car window and watched the city pass by. Somewhere behind him, in a small room in an old orphanage, a little boy sat alone with his memories. Neither of them knew that their lives were about to become connected in ways neither could imagine. The story was just beginning. 2 weeks passed. Richard tried to forget about the orphanage. He tried to forget about that quiet little boy with the old notebook. He went back to his normal life. Board meetings, business dinners, phone calls that never seemed to end, but something had changed inside him. At night, when he lay in his huge bed in his empty mansion, he kept seeing those eyes. Those deep, sad eyes that seemed to look right through him. He kept seeing those small hands trembling above the piano keys. It bothered him. And Richard did not like being bothered. His public relations team was happy with the orphanage visit. The video had done well on the internet. People were starting to forget about his earlier mistake. But they wanted more. "You should go back," his lead assistant told him one morning. "Maybe actually adopt a child this time. It would be great for your image." Richard thought about it. He did not want to be a father. He did not know how to be a father. But his curiosity about that boy was eating at him. He told himself it was just business. Just another way to look good for the public. So he went back. This time, he brought even more cameras. He brought reporters from 2 different news channels. He wanted the whole world to see what a generous man he was. Mrs. Chun welcomed him again, though this time her smile seemed a little more cautious. She had seen many wealthy people come to the orphanage over the years. Most of them came for show. Very few actually cared about the children. "I want to see Daniel," Richard said as soon as he walked in. Mrs. Chun looked surprised. "Daniel? Are you sure?" "He is not the most outgoing child." "I know," Richard said. "That is why I want to see him." They found Daniel in the same spot as before, the corner of the recreation room, the old notebook in his arms. It was like the boy had not moved in 2 weeks. Richard walked over to him. The cameras followed. Daniel looked up at the rich man, but did not say anything. "Hello there," Richard said, putting on his best friendly voice. "Do you remember me?" Daniel nodded slowly. Of course, he remembered. How could anyone forget a man who arrived with so much noise and so many cameras? Richard sat down on a small chair near the boy. It was uncomfortable and too small for him, but he wanted to be at the same level as the child. "Mrs. Chun tells me you have been here for a long time," Richard said. "Do you like it here?" Daniel shrugged. It was neither a yes nor a no. "Do you have any friends?" Another shrugged-out Richard was starting to feel frustrated. He was not used to being ignored. People usually fell over themselves trying to impress him. But this small boy acted like Richard was just another stranger. Which, of course, he was. Then Richard noticed Daniel glancing at something across the room. He followed the boy's gaze and saw the old piano sitting against the wall. The same piano Daniel had approached during his last visit. A thought formed in Richard's mind. A terrible thought, really. The kind of thought that showed who he truly was inside. "You like that piano, don't you?" Richard asked. For the first time, Daniel's eyes showed a spark of something. Interest, maybe. Or fear. It was hard to tell. "Can you play it?" Richard asked. Daniel looked down at his notebook. He did not answer. Richard smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who always got what he wanted. The smile of a man who saw everything as a game to be won. He stood up and spoke loudly, so everyone in the room could hear. The cameras turned toward him. The reporters raised their microphones. "I have an idea," Richard announced. "This boy here says he can play piano." Daniel's eyes went wide. He had not said that at all. "So here is what I am going to do," Richard continued. "If this little boy can sit at that piano and play something that impresses me, I will adopt him. Right here. Right now. Today." A gasp went through the room. The other children stopped what they were doing and stared. The staff members looked at each other with worried eyes. Mrs. Chun stepped forward. "Mr. Richard, please," she said quietly. "This is not appropriate. You cannot treat a child like this. Daniel is very sensitive, and—" Richard held up his hand to stop her. "I am offering to give this boy a home. A real home. With everything he could ever want. All he has to do is show me what he can do." He turned back to Daniel with that same cold smile. "What do you say, little one? Think you can impress a billionaire?" The room was completely silent. Everyone was watching. The cameras were recording everything. Daniel sat frozen in his chair, his small body trembling. Some of the older kids started to whisper. A few of them laughed nervously. One boy said something about Daniel being weird, and how there was no way he could play piano. Daniel heard them. His face turned red. His hands gripped his notebook so tightly, his knuckles went white. Richard watched all of this with amusement. He did not actually expect the boy to do anything. In his mind, this was just entertainment. The kid would probably cry or run away, and then Richard would pretend to be generous and donate some money to the orphanage anyway. Good content for the cameras. That was all he cared about. "Come on," Richard said, gesturing toward the piano. "Do not be shy. Show everyone what you can do. Unless there is nothing to show." More whispers. More quiet laughs from the other children. Mrs. Chun looked like she wanted to say something, but one of Richard's assistants was already guiding her away from the cameras. They did not want her to ruin the shot. Daniel slowly stood up. He was so small, so fragile looking. His old clothes hung loose on his thin body. His messy hair fell into his eyes. He looked at Richard, then at the cameras, then at the piano across the room. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Daniel took a step forward. And another. And another. He walked across the room like he was walking toward something sacred. Something important. The other children moved out of his way, suddenly quiet. When he reached the piano, Daniel stopped. He ran his small fingers along the dusty wood. He touched the scratched surface gently, almost lovingly. Richard watched with raised eyebrows. This was not what he expected. Daniel climbed onto the bench. His feet dangled far above the floor. He placed his precious notebook beside him, open to a page filled with handwritten notes that no one could see clearly. He looked at the keys. Those old, yellowed keys that had not been played in years. The room held its breath. Richard leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. He was already thinking about what he would say when the boy failed. Something kind but pitying. Something that would make him look good. But then Daniel lifted his hands, and everything changed. Daniel closed his eyes. His small hands hovered above the keys, just like they had 2 weeks ago when Richard had secretly watched him. But this time, something was different. This time, there was no trembling, no fear. This time, Daniel was ready. He took a deep breath. The whole room was silent. You could hear the wind blowing outside. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Every single person was watching this tiny boy sitting at an old, dusty piano. Richard still had that smirk on his face. He was waiting for the boy to fail, waiting for the awkward moment when Daniel would press a few wrong notes and then run away crying. It would make for good television, he thought, but then Daniel's fingers touched the keys, and the first note rang out. It was a single note, pure and clear. It floated through the room like something alive, something beautiful. Then came the second note, and the third. And suddenly, Daniel was not just pressing keys anymore. He was playing, really playing. The music that came out of that old piano was like nothing anyone in that room had ever heard. It started soft and gentle, like a whisper, like a secret being shared. The melody was sad but beautiful. It made you think of rainy days and quiet moments and memories you thought you had forgotten. Richard's smirk disappeared. His arms slowly dropped to his sides. His mouth fell open just a little bit. What was happening? Daniel's small fingers moved across the keys with a speed and skill that seemed impossible. This was not a child banging on a piano. This was not a beginner trying to play a simple song. This was something else entirely. This was mastery. The music grew stronger. The notes came faster. Daniel's whole body swayed with the rhythm. His eyes stayed closed, but his face showed every emotion the music carried. Pain, hope, loss, love, it was all there, pouring out through his fingertips. One of the camera operators lowered his camera. He forgot he was supposed to be filming. He just stood there, listening, with tears forming in his eyes. Mrs. Chun covered her mouth with her hands. Tears were already running down her cheeks. In 20 years of running this orphanage, she had never seen anything like this. She had never heard anything like this. The other children stood frozen. The ones who had laughed at Daniel just moments ago now looked ashamed. Some of the younger ones sat down on the floor, completely hypnotized by the music. And Richard could not move, could not speak, could not think. He had met presidents and kings. He had attended concerts by the most famous musicians in the world. He had bought paintings worth millions of dollars. He thought he knew what talent looked like. He thought he knew what genius was. But this little boy in worn-out clothes, sitting at a broken-down piano in an orphanage, was showing him something he had never seen before. The music shifted. It became more complex, more powerful. Daniel was playing things that professional pianists spent years trying to master. His small hands stretched across the keys, hitting notes that seemed too far apart for a child to reach. But he reached them, every single one. Then something even more amazing happened. Daniel opened his eyes and glanced at the notebook beside him. The page was filled with handwritten musical notes, old paper, faded ink. But Daniel was not really reading it. He knew the music by heart. The notebook was just there for comfort, for connection, because this was not just any music. This was his mother's music. Richard did not know that yet. None of them did. But they could feel it. They could feel that this was something personal, something sacred. Daniel was not just performing. He was remembering. He was honoring. He was keeping someone alive through these notes. The melody changed again. It became softer now, gentler, like a lullaby, like a mother singing to her child before sleep. Some of the staff members were openly crying now. Even the tough-looking security guard Richard had brought was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Daniel kept playing. Song after song. Piece after piece. Some were classical compositions that took trained musicians years to learn. Others were original melodies written in that old notebook. All of them were perfect. Richard finally found the strength to move. He took a few steps closer to the piano. He watched Daniel's hands. He watched the boy's face. There was no showing off. No arrogance. Daniel played like he was alone in the room. Like he was playing for someone only he could see. Maybe he was. When Daniel finally played the last note, he let it ring out until it faded into silence. Then he slowly lowered his hands to his lap. He opened his eyes and looked down at the keys. For a moment, nobody made a sound. Then the room exploded. Everyone started clapping. Not polite clapping. Not the kind of clapping you do at the end of a boring speech. This was real. This was from the heart. People were cheering. People were shouting. Some of the children rushed forward to hug Daniel, suddenly seeing him in a completely different way. But Daniel did not seem to notice any of it. He picked up his notebook and held it close to his chest. He looked tired, drained, like he had just given away a piece of his soul. Richard stood in the middle of the chaos, completely still. His mind was racing. His heart was pounding. He had spent his whole life measuring the world in dollars and deals. Everything had a price. Everything could be bought or sold, but what he had just witnessed had no price. There was no amount of money that could create what that little boy had just done. No business strategy. No marketing plan. Just pure, raw, heartbreaking talent. And Richard had mocked him. He had turned this child into a spectacle. He had challenged him like it was a joke. Like Daniel was entertainment for his cameras, the shame hit Richard like a wave. It crashed over him and left him struggling to breathe. When was the last time he had felt shame? He could not remember. He had built his whole life around never feeling weak, never feeling wrong. But right now, standing in this old orphanage with tears in his eyes, Richard felt more wrong than he had ever felt in his entire life. The cameras were still rolling. The reporters were talking excitedly into their microphones about what they had just witnessed. This was going to be the story of the year. A hidden genius discovered in an orphanage. A child prodigy who could play like a master. But Richard did not care about any of that anymore. He only cared about one thing. He walked slowly toward Daniel. The crowd parted to let him through. Everyone watched, wondering what the billionaire would do next. Daniel looked up at him. Those deep, old eyes met Richard's, and in that moment, Richard saw himself clearly for the first time in decades. He saw the selfish man he had become, the empty life he had built, the walls he had put around his heart to keep everyone out. This little boy had torn down those walls in 15 minutes. With nothing but music and truth, Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? What words could ever be enough? Daniel watched him quietly, still holding his notebook, waiting, not judging. Just waiting. The room fell silent again. Everyone held their breath. What would happen next would change both of their lives forever. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Richard stood there, looking down at this small boy who had just shattered everything he thought he knew about the world. His expensive suit suddenly felt uncomfortable. His whole body felt wrong. Before he could find the words to speak, Mrs. Chun stepped forward. Her face was wet with tears, but there was something else in her eyes now. Something like relief. Like a secret she had been carrying for years was finally ready to come out. "There is something you need to know," she said softly. Her voice was shaking. "Something about Daniel that I should have told you from the beginning." Richard turned to look at her. The cameras were still rolling, but nobody cared about that anymore. This was not about publicity, no. This was something real. Mrs. Chun walked over to Daniel and knelt down beside him. She put a gentle hand on his shoulder. The boy looked at her with those deep eyes, and something passed between them. An understanding. A permission. Daniel's mother, Mrs. Chun began, was not an ordinary woman. She paused to wipe her eyes. The whole room was listening. Even the children who usually could not sit still were completely quiet. Her name was Lin. She was a concert pianist. One of the best in the country. Maybe one of the best in the world. Richard felt his heart stop for a moment. A concert pianist. That explained so much, but also raised so many more questions. Mrs. Chun continued. Lin performed in the greatest concert halls across the world. She played for kings and presidents. Critics called her a genius. They said her music could make stones weep. She looked at Daniel with such tenderness it made Richard's chest ache. But Lin did not care about fame or money. All she ever wanted was a simple life, a family. When Daniel was born, she gave up touring. She stopped performing in public. She wanted to be home with her son. Daniel was looking down at his notebook now. His small fingers traced the edges of the pages. He knew this story. He had lived it, but hearing it out loud was still hard. Lin taught Daniel everything she knew, Mrs. Chun said. From the moment he could sit up, she put him at the piano. Not to make him famous, not to show him off, but because music was how she showed love. It was the language they shared. One of the younger staff members was crying openly now. Even the tough cameraman had lowered his equipment, too moved to keep filming. When Daniel was 3 years old, Lin got sick. Very sick. The doctors said there was nothing they could do. She had maybe a year left. Mrs. Chun's voice broke. She had to stop and take a breath before she could continue. Lin spent that last year doing one thing. She wrote music. Piece after piece. Song after song. She filled notebook after notebook with compositions. Some were complex classical pieces. Others were simple lullabies. All of them were for Daniel. Richard looked at the worn notebook in Daniel's arms. Suddenly, he understood why the boy held it so tightly. Why he never let anyone touch it. That notebook was not just paper and ink. It was his mother's voice. Her last gift to him. Lin told me something before she died, Mrs. Chun said. I visited her in the hospital near the end. She could barely speak. But she grabbed my hand and made me promise to watch over Daniel, to make sure he never forgot the music. Tears were streaming down Mrs. Chun's face now. She did not try to hide them. She said the music would save him one day, that it would lead him to where he needed to be. I did not understand what she meant then, but I think I understand now. The room was completely silent, except for the sound of people crying. Richard felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He had walked into this orphanage looking for a photo opportunity. He had treated this child like a toy, like entertainment. And all along, Daniel had been carrying something so precious, so sacred, that Richard could not even begin to understand it. What about his father? Someone asked quietly. It was one of the reporters, but her voice had lost all its professional sharpness. She sounded like a regular person now, just someone who wanted to know the rest of the story. Mrs. Chun shook her head sadly. Lin's husband was a good man, but he loved her too much. When she died, something inside him broke. He could not look at Daniel without seeing Lin. The pain was too great. She sighed heavily. One night, about 6 months after Lin passed, he brought Daniel to a hospital. He told the nurses he would be right back. He never returned. Gasp went through the room. Some people shook their heads in disbelief. Others cried harder. We found Daniel sitting alone in the waiting room the next morning, Mrs. Chun continued. He was holding that notebook. He did not cry. He did not speak. He just held on to those pages, like they were the only thing keeping him alive. Richard closed his eyes. He thought about his own father, a cold man who had never shown him love, who had taught him that money was the only thing that mattered. Richard had spent his whole life trying to prove himself to a man who was never satisfied, but at least his father had stayed. At least Richard had never known the kind of abandonment Daniel had experienced. For the first year here, Daniel did not speak at all, Mrs. Chun said. We thought maybe he would never speak again. The therapist said he had experienced too much trauma, too much loss for such a young heart to handle. She smiled softly at Daniel, but slowly he started to open up. A word here, a sentence there. He never talked about his mother or his father, but sometimes, late at night, I would hear music coming from this room. She gestured toward the old piano. Daniel would sneak out of his bed and come here when everyone was asleep. He would play for hours, always with that notebook open beside him. I never stopped him. I knew that was his way of staying connected to his mother, his way of healing. Richard finally found his voice. It came out rough and broken. Why did you never tell anyone about his talent? He asked. He could be in a music school. He could be performing. He could be. Mrs. Chun held up her hand gently. That was Daniel's choice, not mine. I asked him once if he wanted to play for other people, if he wanted to show the world what he could do. She looked at Daniel. The boy met her eyes. He said no. He said the music was for his mother, not for strangers, not for applause, just for her. Richard felt something crack inside his chest. This boy had the talent to be famous, to be rich, to have everything the world could offer, and he had chosen to keep it private, to keep it pure. Meanwhile, Richard had spent his whole life chasing fame and money. And what did he have to show for it? An empty mansion. No family, no real friends. Just cameras and contracts and people who only wanted something from him. He looked at Daniel again. The boy was watching him quietly. No anger in his eyes. No judgment. Just patience. Richard took a shaky breath. He knew what he had to do. He knew what he wanted to say, but the words felt too small for what he was feeling. Still, he had to try. He walked over to Daniel and did something he had not done since he was a child himself. He got down on his knees. The cameras captured everything. But for once, Richard did not care. Let the whole world see. Let them see the billionaire on his knees in front of a little orphan boy Dot. It was the most honest thing he had done in years. Daniel, Richard said softly, I am so sorry. The boy looked at him, waiting, listening, and Richard knew that whatever came next would be the most important moment of his life. Richard stayed on his knees. He did not care how foolish he looked. He did not care that the cameras were recording every second. For the first time in his adult life, he was not thinking about his image or his business or what other people would say. He was only thinking about this little boy in front of him. I came here for the wrong reasons, Richard said. His voice was quiet but steady. I came here to look good, to fix my reputation. I did not come here to help anyone. I came here to help myself. Daniel listened without moving. His big eyes never left Richard's face. When I saw you sitting alone in that corner, I thought you were weak. I thought you were someone I could use for my cameras. Someone who would make me look generous without me having to actually be generous. Richard's voice cracked. He had to stop and take a breath. I challenged you to play that piano because I wanted to embarrass you. I wanted to show everyone that I was powerful and you are nothing. I wanted to feel big by making you feel small. Tears were rolling down Richard's cheeks now. He did not wipe them away. But you showed me something today. You showed me what real strength looks like. It is not about money or power or how many people know your name. Real strength is what you have. The courage to keep going when everything has been taken from you. The love you carry for your mother, even though she is gone. The gift you protect in that notebook. He shook his head slowly. I have spent 52 years building walls around my heart. I told myself it was to stay strong. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of being hurt. Scared of being alone. Scared of feeling anything real. Richard looked into Daniel's eyes. You are 8 years old, and you are braver than I have ever been. I am so sorry for what I did today. I am so sorry for mocking you. You deserved so much better. The room was completely silent. Everyone was watching. Waiting. Then something happened that nobody expected. Daniel reached out his small hand and touched Richard's face. Just a gentle touch on his cheek where the tears were falling. It is okay, Daniel said softly. They were the first words he had spoken all day. Maybe the first words he had spoken in weeks. And they were words of forgiveness. Richard broke down completely. He pulled the boy into a hug and held him tight. His whole body shook with sobs. All the pain he had been carrying for decades came pouring out. All the loneliness. All the emptiness. All the pretending. Daniel did not pull away. He let this broken man hold him. And slowly, carefully, he wrapped his small arms around Richard's neck. Mrs. Chun was crying. The staff members were crying. Even the reporters had tears streaming down their faces. This was not a story anymore. This was something sacred. Something private. Something that cameras could never really capture. After a long moment, Richard pulled back. He wiped his face with his sleeve, not caring about his expensive suit. I know I do not deserve it, he said. But I want to try. I want to try to be better. Not for the cameras. Not for anyone else. For you. And for me. He took a shaky breath. I am not asking you to forgive me right away. I am not asking you to trust me. I am just asking for a chance. A chance to show you that I can change. That I can be someone worth knowing. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Those deep, old eyes studied Richard's face like he was reading a book. Looking for lies. Looking for tricks. But all he found was truth. Daniel reached down and picked up his notebook. The precious notebook filled with his mother's music. The only thing he had left of her. And then he did something he had never done before. He handed it to Richard. Mrs. Chun gasped. She knew what that notebook meant to Daniel. She knew he had never let anyone touch it. Not once in 5 years. Richard looked at the worn pages in his hands. The handwritten musical notes. The faded ink. The love that had gone into every single mark. She would want you to see it, Daniel said quietly. She always said music was meant to be shared. Richard held the notebook like it was made of gold. No, more precious than gold. More precious than anything he had ever owned. Thank you, he whispered. I will take care of it. I promise. The adoption process took 3 months. There were interviews and home visits and mountains of paperwork. Richard had to prove that he was serious. That he was not just doing this for publicity. He sold his company. He stepped away from the spotlight. He bought a smaller house, one with a garden where a boy could play. And most importantly, he bought the finest piano money could find. On the day Daniel officially became his son, Richard did not invite any cameras. No reporters. No publicity teams. Just Mrs. Chun and a few staff members from the orphanage, who had become like family to Daniel over the years. They had a small party with cake and balloons. Daniel smiled more than anyone had ever seen him smile. It was not a big smile. It was small and shy. But it was real. That night, Richard tucked Daniel into bed in his new room. The walls were painted soft blue. There were books on the shelves and toys in the corner. But the most important thing in the room sat by the window. The notebook. Daniel kept it on his knitstand, where he could see it every night before he fell asleep. "Good night, son," Richard said softly. It was the first time he had called Daniel that. The word felt strange on his tongue. Strange but wonderful. "Good night," Daniel replied. Then, after a pause, he added something else. "Dad," Richard's heart nearly burst. He had to leave the room quickly before he started crying again. Months passed. Then years. Daniel enrolled in a music school where his talent was recognized and nurtured. But he never performed for fame or money. He played because he loved it, because it connected him to his mother, because it was who he was. Richard learned to be a father. It was not easy. He made mistakes. He said wrong things. He did not always understand what Daniel needed, but he kept trying. Every single day, he kept trying. He learned that love was not about being perfect. It was about showing up, about being there, about listening even when you did not understand. On the 1-year anniversary of the adoption, Richard took Daniel back to the orphanage. They donated a new piano to replace the old one. They set up a scholarship fund for children who wanted to learn music. And Daniel played a concert for all the kids who were still waiting for families of their own. This time, when Daniel sat at the piano, he was not alone. Richard sat in the front row, watching with tears of pride in his eyes. The music filled the room, beautiful and sad and hopeful all at once. It told the story of a mother who loved her son enough to leave him music that would last forever. It told the story of a boy who kept that love alive through the darkest times. And it told the story of a man who had finally learned what really mattered in life. When the last note faded away, Daniel looked at Richard. Father and son. Two broken people who had found each other. No words were needed. The billionaire, who once mocked a little boy, had been completely transformed. Not by money or power or fame, but by the simple, devastating, beautiful power of love. And Daniel, the quiet boy who once sat alone in a corner with his mother's notebook, had finally found what he had been waiting for all along. A home, a family, a place where his music would always be heard. And that is where our story ends. Not with fame or fortune, but with something much more valuable. With two hearts that finally found their way to each other.